Even after all these years, I still can't decide how I actually feel about Shadow of Destiny, but I think I like it. Originally released on the PlayStation 2 in early 2001, before making a further splash on Xbox and then PC within the next 2 years, though it did have inconsistent regional releases, this game became a cult classic, and it's easy to see why. It does a lot right, and most importantly, this story-driven game does present an interesting tale between all the scenes that exist to only make me feel uncomfortable for enjoying it. But as is often the case, I'm here with the PSP release, which is just weird for existing since this came out in 2009 and 2010 for its 2 regions. That's quite a gulf of time from the original 2001 release. The people behind this must have really cared. Junko Kawano wrote, directed, and was the character designer here, and this is clearly something she poured her heart into. This is further shown with the spiritual successor to this game, Time Hollow, which is a story for another time. And while today's topic, Shadow of Memory, was the first game she led, her resume includes the Suikoden games, which isn't relevant in any way except I need to promote Suikoden in every way I'm allowed to. Play those games, please. Unfortunately, the original Shadow of Destiny was still a mixed bag to critics and players when it first came out, and near a decade of technological advances and standardizations of games only made those flaws more apparent, as this handheld version was rated more harshly than the original. But you can't trust the reviews from the early 2000s. Some of them praised this game for its voice acting, and that's only because we didn't know any better in 2001. The original releases had the kind of voice acting you'd expect from a game dub in the era, with the only notable aspect being Charles Martinet's performance, which is mostly talked about because it's Charles Martinet. Depending on who you ask, this was improved or ruined with the PSP release, which redid all the voices, and they're better here. But the problem is, they're better here. Cheesy B-grade voice acting was part of the game's original charm, and it's not quite the same without it, so I'll just be a little sad that instead we actually have some good voices this time around. The only other issue I really have with this new cast is the lead is Yuri Lowenthal, so now the protagonist Ike sounds like every other character Yuri has voiced, but hey, at least he knows how to act, which the original version was lacking. Other than that, it's gone from B-grade acting to maybe B+ acting. It's not amazing, but it works well enough for what it is. And it's good to have believable voice acting, since watching cutscenes is most of the actual game here. Don't expect thrilling gameplay, this is just a vehicle for the story its creator wanted to tell. The gameplay itself just amounts to walking around a small town that you'll become too familiar with, and talking to characters that you need to talk to, using items you need to use, and all the unimportant NPCs can be talked to even though it's entirely pointless to do so. The original reviews 20 years ago called this game a Shenmue-like game, and I can kinda see it, though they are entirely different beasts, and Shadow can't hold a candle to my weird love of Shenmue. But they're similar enough to a layperson, and it's an easy way to say the game has barely any gameplay, though Shenmue still outdoes Shadow here since that game actually had a game buried inside it. But at least in Shadow of Destiny's favour, the movement, while a little awkward and rigid, is better than Shenmue's movement. We have precise movement options here, but it does require turning the camera all the time, and this is done with just the L and R shoulder buttons, so something that's usually a downside of PSP ports of home console games of the era, the lack of 2 analog sticks, isn't an issue here since the console version didn't even use the right stick. However, that does mean we can't raise the camera and it's often pointed way too low, so we get a great view of Ike's long legs but not the immediate environment. You do get used to it, and given what the game asks of you, it's forgivable. Precise movement and positioning isn't really asked of you. And that's because this is a full-on adventure game, but made for the Y2K audience. And much like the genre's pedigree, all you really do is solve puzzles with the least intuitive solutions because the designer has a specific set of things in mind, and we can't argue against that. This idea is tested to its extreme because of the actual premise here, but even when things make no logical sense, I'm just so invested in this wild ride that I can't stop. The story is initially about a man named Ike in a German town who just gets murdered immediately, but is then brought back to life and returned to a time shortly before the murder by a mysterious magical being called Homunculus. However, Ike being alive isn't enough to resolve this, since the murderer will just kill Ike again. Murderers are kind of inconvenient like that. So Ike is gifted with the power to travel in time to very specific plot important times to cut out the root of this issue, since delaying murder by half an hour or so each time, like the opening has us do, is not a great long-term goal. This culminates in 4 main time periods we revisit and get to know. The present of 2001, a little over 20 years prior to roughly 1980, the even older past of 1901, and then all the way back to the 16th century. These start off feeling random and unrelated, but they're actually important to the overall package, even if it takes almost too long for it to properly land. Just go with the flow, don't think about it too much. The game has a story it wants to tell, so don't argue against it, even if it feels illogical. Just sit back and wait for it to all unfold. And to properly understand everything, you just need to beat the game multiple times and see every ending. They range from A to E, and then there are a couple more for the diligent players who get every other ending first. Fatigue is avoided thanks to the ability to skip cutscenes you've already seen before, so the pace is ramped up the more you revisit the game since you'll be skipping almost everything. You can avoid almost every cutscene on your replays, but if you're like me, you can go to the extreme and find all the pointless fluff this game seems to only include for people like me. You can take a cat from 2001 back in time 100 years to make some girl happy, butterfly effect be damned. Or the bartender in the present can repeatedly try talking about his grandkids and show you photos if you do a set of weirdly specific things first to unlock this. But hey, that's neat. Or you can get a frying pan in a different way than your first playthrough, or better yet, avoid that by using an old metal sign. I know this doesn't sound exciting, but it's fun that the team behind this made sure to include pointless fun scenes, since the game has to be replayed a lot to get the full story. And why have a time travel game with all these familiar NPCs if you can't just exploit it to find out every little thing? Unfortunately, the majority of NPCs in this game are pointless, and worst of all, they're just kind of creepy. This, at times, is a beautiful game across its multiple releases, but the care was put into Ike first and foremost, and his weirdly long legs get more detail than the entire bodies of the townspeople. And it even extended to the PSP game that renders the characters' fingers as separate digits and not some kind of knit. Wow, this is actually a PSP powerhouse if you think about it. The only graphical flaw with this specific release is the backgrounds pulsate and some textures warp a little. But hey, it still looks great for this hardware, and it's an excellent conversion that doesn't have the weird bug-eyed thing like Thug 2 Remix, for example. And in some areas, this PSP version looks better than its big console counterparts. The loading screen is a lot calmer than the hectic one of before. The UI in general has small touch-ups. Look at this new Digipad, or I should say Z-Pad as it's been renamed. It just looks so much prettier, and more importantly, it's way more readable. The most dramatic touch-up was the game's ending screens, which have been completely redrawn. While I kinda prefer the old ones, these are nice in their own right, and there's a lot of detail put into them. Plus, the one that was just a black screen is actually illustrated now. And while on the topic of small improvements to this PSP version that made the original look a bit worse, even if it's still good, Ike keeps a notebook on him, which for the player means that he writes everything of importance that happens, and it's a good place to look if you get stuck, or if you put down the game for weeks and come back not remembering where you're up to. Originally, it was just plain text on a black background, which is still nice, and would make a great accessibility option, but the PSP version embraces this and gives us his memos in an actual notebook. Maybe the critics from 2001 had a sneak peek at the PSP version almost a decade early, because this is like the most Shenmue thing here. The notebook, regardless of what system it's still being played on, is such a wonderful feature, and it goes to show the effort the developers went to make sure the player never gets stuck. In addition to that, interactable objects glow, and the doors that can be entered are marked with big, obvious glowing indicators, and these can be turned off as well if you're the kind of person who hates guidance. but it's especially helpful since this is a game that has you on a timer all the time. Ike is constantly predestined to die thanks to his murderer, and thanks to this game's specific time travel mechanics, even when Ike is back in time, he'll still die if he takes too long, thanks to the relative time of the present. We have 2 clocks in the corner, one for the relative present, and one for whichever time he is in. If he spends too long and would have died in the present, he will die in the past. So don't dawdle. Though this PSP release does have the option to save mid-chapter, which makes sense for a game you're probably playing while you're out and about, and it would inevitably help ease new players who get stressed by timers in games they're unfamiliar with. So if that's you, the PSP version's easily the way to go. Another example of this game going out of its way to convey mechanics to the player is that whenever Ike has an important line of dialogue that will alter which ending he has, he will do a double take and reiterate to himself that this is probably an important line, and then he gives us the player the option to redo that line. This helps prevent players who button mash from accidentally messing up, and it does also highlight to players which options they can do differently if they want a different outcome, without having to resort to some kind of guide. These kinds of carefully implemented ideas are all paramount because, like I said earlier, this is an adventure game and logical solutions are never really here. So instead of crafting a sensible story, they went all out and didn't do that, but they at least had the courtesy to make everything of importance stand out. Perhaps the most infamous example of how roundabout everything is incredibly early on, when Ike has to avoid being murdered by an assailant hiding behind the tree. So the obvious solution here has Ike go back in time several hundred years and prevent the tree from being planted, and in order to do that he must grab a ladder, go to a guard who has a key to the Squire's property, give him a postcard from the future so he'll be allowed in, and then with this ladder he will steal a crest that is mounted to the exterior of the property but is loose, and with this big metal plate in hand, Ike will show it to the guy planting the tree, and tell him the Squire wants something else to be here instead. This helps delay Ike's murder because there isn't a tree anymore. This is perhaps the funniest example, but the whole game continues ideas that are so odd. Ike casually changes the timeline to put a library in his town just so he can do research on an important topic, which sounds hilarious now, but in 2001 this was still easier for us to do than connect to the internet to get information ourselves. But the game always feels like a bit of a farce. It's not bad writing per se, it's just having fun with the genre, and that is my excuse and I'm sticking to it. And for what it's worth, the actual core story under all this fluff is pretty good, it just takes a while to understand it fully. A single playthrough will leave you with a not satisfying ending and a lot of unanswered questions, but those all get answered through replays, and it's a joy that the story never loses its luster as new bits of information are constantly around the corner and string you along. The story had to be a weird, convoluted mess to tell the exact story envisioned, and while it's messy and all over the place, it's a case of the ends justifying the means. These characters all feel really artificial and no one acts like a person should in any situation. But hey, this is a classic example of characters not doing the smart things because if they did the smart things there wouldn't be a plot. So be quiet and enjoy the ride. Homunculus and his complex motives need to be explained slowly. And the thing is, most of the people I've heard talk about this game, whether they be 20-year-old magazine reviews or friends and peers I've talked to while writing this, all agree that these faults are here. It's hard to deny just how convoluted this is, but what is never shared is how much this detracts from the game, or if it even does at all. Some people are more forgiving of obvious issues like this, some don't even care even if it acknowledge their existence, and others hate this game because of these hang-ups. It's fascinating seeing people's perspectives be entirely different just due to these same core issues that no one is really denying exist. They're here. I know they're here. I can put on my critical lens and complain, but at the end of the day it didn't really faze me. At worst I found it funny. Though it is worth stating, I became much more forgiving of the eccentricities after having seen the complete picture after the end of the game. But forget about that. Any game where I get to feed a dog is good in my books. But this is still the most divided I've felt on a game in a while, because ultimately it's not really a fun game to play, and a lot of the writing is awkward with robotic character interactions, but the bits that shine really do shine and they stuck with me. This is a clear example of something being better than the sum of its parts. It won't appeal to everybody, or frankly a lot of people, but I enjoyed it, and you can trust what I say, because I seem to enjoy everything and I'm never too critical of any game, even the ones that are demonstrably unpopular and hated. Why does anyone listen to what I have to say? Anyway, play this game if you like weird, obtuse games with good stories that take ages for the story to actually get good. I know that doesn't sound like a glowing review, but the overall package is so good they didn't even need to fix the typo in the memo section.